let's get started. Welcome to the panel on what's this anthology about, or whatever it's called about the anthology.
So tell me about this anthology.
You want me to tell you about the anthology?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I will tell you about the anthology. My name is Chris Bell. I'm this year's chair of the symposium and the finance person, but I'm also a small press publisher. I'm the managing editor of a press called Athos Arts. And our plan for the anthology is we want to find small presses that will publish these anthologies. But as we're going to talk about, anthologies are really expensive if you pay rates, and they are risky. They don't necessarily have a long sales life. And so finding a publisher when we're bringing back the brand new anthology for the first year is really hard. And we're like, well, you know, I better put my money where my mouth is. And that's who I am, and that's what I'll be talking about, the publishing side of it. And we have the editor of the anthology, Toiya Kristen Finley, and we also have the cover artist, Alex Steffen. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little more.
Hello, everyone. I am Toiya Kristen Finley. I'm a writer and editor in general. I've worked on everything from prose fiction to academic writing to video games. I'm also a game designer, narrative designer, editor, diversity consultant, and narrative consultant in games. This is my first major editing project in a while. I started a literary journal when I was getting my doctorate years ago. So this was me flexing my editing muscle again on like a grand scale. I do work with independent writers as well. I do a lot of developmental editing for them. And I'm really excited to talk to you about how we put this together.
Hi everyone, I am Alex Steffen. I'm an illustrator from Indianapolis. I currently go to school in Cincinnati, at the Art Academy of Cincinnati, getting my bachelor's degree right now, and I'm a practicing illustrator, and I got this project and really wanted to, show off my skills a little bit and have some fun. But yeah, that's me.
So one of the first things I actually wanted to ask you, Chris, is because I was shocked to find out that there had been a symposium anthology in the past.
Yeah.
My first GenCon was either 2016 or 2017, and the last anthology came out in 2011. So why did you feel like this is the right time to bring the anthology back?
So I think it's actually late to bring it back, the fact that we had to bring it back, especially since COVID. So if you've been going to the symposium for a while, you know that the leadership recently changed just prior to COVID. And one thing that the symposium, at least the new team really wanted to do is like, we want to have a book. We want to have a book. If you've ever been to Origins Game Fair, they have an anthology. It's a much smaller writer track, which makes this project so much more complicated. But we always knew we wanted to have an anthology. We wanted to sell the anthology here because we want the authors that come to the Writers' Symposium, for the vast majority of them are coming on their own dime. They're paying their travel, they're paying for their hotel room, they're paying for their parking, they're paying for their meals, and we give them some opportunities to sell some of their books, but we want to pay back more of that, and we want to keep doing it. I mean, our ultimate goal is to pay every author to get here. That's a really high, ambitious goal when you're talking about 60 authors, but this is one way to do it. And we've been fortunate that the folks at GenCon have been very supportive of this. They were supportive of us having the Meet the Writers, which is tonight, which is where the writers can set up their own books and sell books themselves. We can help take credit cards and stuff like that. But again, this is one more step towards doing that. It's kind of like having multiple income streams. We've got to try to find everything that will work, that will bring us some budget, that we can bring more authors in and compensate them.
And like the look of the anthology, it's not just about like getting stories and putting them in the book. There's a layout process. This anthology has some cool little details in it.
Yeah.
So what was your process for the layout, and how did you come up with like some of the details that are in the book itself?
So As a small press, we do pretty much all of, I mean, usually what a small press will do is either they do all of their own layout and typesetting in-house, or they will hire an independent contractor that does freelance stuff. We do, for our small press, we do all of our layout in-house. And I'm the one that does it. A small press usually play multiple roles. So I call myself the managing editor, but it also means I'm the finance guy, and I'm the typesetter, and I'm the website guy, and all of that stuff. So I use a tool called Adobe InDesign, which is the professional standard for doing interior layout of a book. I mean, if you're first learning to do this kind of job, you want to pick up a style guide. We use Chicago Manual of Style most of all, but if you look in the Chicago Manual of Style on like page 6, there's this is the parts of a book. This is the front matter. This is what goes on page, I and I and I, and what goes on recto versus verso and that kind of stuff. Once you've done that and you've laid out a bunch of books, you don't ever really need to start from scratch anymore.
Do you have a template that you use?
I do, and we actually have several, but this is our general template for an anthology. We did publish one of the Origins anthologies a while back, and I think I probably used the exact same template for that I used for this, because it's the same trim size, same margins. In the interior, there's some break graphics. And what I try to do with those is I try to pull something from the cover. So, and when Alex goes to talk about this, you'll see that there's the spiral, the what's it called, the perfect proportion.
The golden ratio.
The golden ratio, thank you. There's the golden ratio. So I actually pulled the same golden ratio swirl, and that made the break graphics. And you'll see that also in the ebook as well.
Yeah, I thought that was a really cool touch when I saw that in there. It's like, oh, that's a really nice surprise. It got pulled from the cover. That's really awesome.
So, do you want to keep at it? Do we want to go back and forth, or do you want to?
Oh, I just have one more question
Sure.
for you specifically.
Sure.
And you raised this a little bit at the beginning. It's like, if you are the press and you have to find the printer, right? You're not going to somebody else who's going to publish it for you.
Yep.
What is that process like? Because you said that's costly.
Yeah.
Like, is there a weight between cost and quality? Are you trying to get a little bit of both? Do you have to sacrifice one for the other?
Yeah. I mean, we've done panels before on self-publishing, and that's a full topic. But the printer that we used, and being a small press, we're out of Detroit, and Ann Arbor, Michigan used to be the small press capital printer hub. They had all of these great family-run printing houses that could do short print runs. They could do specialty books. We had a printer that we loved, that we could run 20 hardcover books with foil stamping, all that stuff. Just like in the publishing industry and the printing industry, is the same thing. Giant corporations come, and one after one, our favorite press that we used to go to, and I knew everybody by name, they got bought and then shut down, and everybody laid off. And then the next printing house, also in the Ann Arbor area, got bought, shut down. Luckily, our sales rep got hired by the big corporation, and we keep a relationship, and unfortunately we use them because there's not a whole lot of competition anymore. What I like about the press, the printer that we use right now, though, is they do something called digital offset. Old school printing was offset printing, where you make, a master plate or a master film and stamp those. That's really costly if you're doing a short print run, fewer than 500 copies. If you're making 10,000 copies, it makes it really inexpensive. But so luckily, this is so to your point, and saying like this is a medium quality book, or this is about as good, high a quality as you're going to get for the print run size that we did, which is 400. You could do, and what I would tell a self-published author is, if you only want a handful of copies, you don't know how many you're going to sell, you can do print on demand through like Ingram Spark or KDP. Those, the quality is really good for what it is, but it can be a little inconsistent. All right, so we talked about the printing part about this. The one thing that I am not is I'm not a creative. So I write emails very poorly, and I need to be. I can't copy edit or do anything like that. So, Toiya, why don't you walk us through the process of how we creatively solicit and get stories for the symposium, and how is that different than a broader, publisher that has either an open call or an invitation call?
So we have, how many guests do we have? 60 something?
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah,
60.
roughly 60 something. So we put out a call for submissions for everybody to submit a story. So like in the anthology, you have the guests who are speaking here, the panelists, the people during workshops. And I also asked several people to be readers. I'm blanking on how many now. I think it was 9 total. Because as an editor, I have like the final say, right? But sometimes I just want like a check, because like we all have biases. Like I might be really into a certain genre, and I might not be so into another one. And so I just like getting a lot of information, like, am I missing something with this story? Am I being too harsh on this one? That sort of thing. So it was good to get feedback. And what we did is we had 3 different groups, and amongst each group, they were given a certain number of the stories that came in. I read everything. I made a list of all the stories, jotted down my thoughts about what I felt about each one, and then I looked at what the readers had to say, and sometimes we completely disagreed on stories, and that's okay because people have different tastes. Like, I overruled some people, which I'm the editor, I could do that. So that was a lot of fun, actually going through that process and just seeing sometimes like how differently we thought about stories, or when we were in complete agreement. So there was that process, and I had a list of the stories that I wanted to take, and I also made some editing suggestions. This is actually one thing that sometimes drives me crazy about editors, especially of small presses or independent publishers. It's like, if the story comes in and they want some tweaks, they will reject it. It's like it has to come in perfectly. Like, no. Like, as writers, because I'm also a writer, like, we never feel like the story is done, even after we send it off. Like, as soon as we say, oh God, why didn't I do this? Why did I do that? It's not a big deal to go back to a writer and request edits. It's just part of the process. So I did that for several of the stories, and then we put them together. And I can talk a little bit also about like the order, because I think how you order short stories in an anthology is really important, because it's almost thinking about a rhythm to it as well. You have different links. Like, you could have 5,000 word stories, 4,000 word stories. We have one flash fiction. And for me, I don't want to load you up with like back-to-back 5,000 word stories. I want to give you a breath. So one thing I considered is, okay, what genres do we have? How long are these stories? Are some of them kind of similar? Because I don't want you to read back-to-back stories that are a little bit similar. I also didn't want you to read 2 genres, like one fantasy story, then another fantasy story. Now, some editors are going to think differently that way, like at the beginning, here's all the fantasy, in the middle, here's all the horror, at the end, here's all the science fiction. I didn't want to do it that way. One of the things that I think is amazing about the symposium itself is the diversity of ideas that we have here and how creative and different everyone is. So I wanted you to kind of experience that as you went from story to story to story. And originally, Kat Rambo has a flash fiction piece. I was thinking of putting it in the middle somewhere, where there would be like a break between longer stories. But like, no, this is a perfect coda. So I put it at the end, because it's really asking a question of what's to come. So that's what I wanted to leave readers with. That idea of what's to come, what can possibly be. And I like that idea of leaving the reader with that. So the hardest part for me, I think, was actually figuring out the order. And like, what experience did I want readers to have, not just with the stories, but also in understanding who the writers of these stories were. And so I hope that you get that sense. And that one other thing is, I find this really interesting. It's like something will be in the zeitgeist, and you will have writers send in stories that are extremely similar. So sometimes it's a question of weighing, okay, I like both of these stories, but they're very, very close. And I'm not saying like they're exactly the same, because we have unique perspectives and we aren't going to tell stories in the same way, but sometimes you also have to weigh that as well. Sometimes you have to weigh like the length of stories. You don't want to have too many novelettes, right, unless it's an anthology of novelettes. So there's a lot that goes into the process also of deciding what you're going to take and what you're not going to. Like, I have had several experiences where the editor really liked my story, but like, oh, this is too similar to one that I already had, or, you know, we already had stories of this length that we had already accepted, that sort of thing. So if you are ever sending your stuff out and you're getting a rejection, it doesn't always mean that the story was bad. Like, editors turn away stuff that they love all the time. So thought I would highlight that as well. But yeah, and also you can ask me more questions about like the content and how I thought about putting things together when we're done up here too.
Yeah, I'm just going to comment that Emily, the executive editor, my spouse, wanted Toiya to be the editor, and you highlighted one of the reasons, which is that as our small press, we like that editing style. We don't reject stories that we can work with, that can be, you know, that we can go back to the author and work on and really make something shine. And we knew that you do that too, and so that was a really good pair. Correct me if I'm wrong. The name Interdimensions was your idea.
Yes. So titles are super important, and sometimes it is harder for me to come up with a title than to write a story. And that might sound ridiculous, but it's true. Sometimes titles come very easily for me. For me, unique titles are important. You don't want to go to Amazon, you know, search for title, and you've got like 10 books that all have the same title. Uniqueness is important because it makes you stand out. So I wanted a unique title. I also wanted something that represented the different genres and the content. You'll find that like there are fantasy stories and science fiction stories, but they kind of have a slipstreamy quality to them. And if you aren't familiar with that genre, I can explain it in a second. But Interdimensions just really seemed to fit with like the variety and like the different voices, and it was a unique title, we found out. So that's why we ran with that.
The unique one. I have a family member that wrote a biography, and they titled it "Breaking the Mold," which, if you pull that up on Amazon, it's like on page 5. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's so that's. And when Toiya came up with that, and I hate coming up with titles too, and we were at a loss. Toiya came up with this fabulous title, and then after we saw Alex's cover art on it and how we put it together, it's like, you know, not only is this a good title for this year, but why don't we make this the title going forward, and let's just volume it. And so now we've got volume 1, and that way hopefully it starts to develop a brand name, and next year people, it's like, hey, I want to get this year's Interdimensions. And I'm really excited about that part. Okay, so kind of a segue question for Toiya is, when you're editing, how do we start? And I can answer from a publisher side, but do you start picturing what the cover could look like as you're editing? And how did we come up with the guidance that we eventually gave to Alex for like what we were just kind of looking for?
So I wasn't thinking about that specifically as I was editing. It was more after I had figured out what I wanted in the book. I'm a highly audiovisual person, so I see stuff all the time, like literal things in my head. So that's the idea of like the fragmentation. Like inner dimensions kind of peeking into different worlds because we have a lot of different worlds in the book. So I was seeing like the fragmentation and like seeing different worlds in those fragments themselves. And so that's what I communicated with Alex. And like, Alex isn't going to have time to like read the entire book. So what I thought was I didn't want to necessarily replicate the stories themselves on the cover. I kind of wanted to give a sense of the different worlds that people might be experiencing. So that's what I shared with Alex as well. Because sometimes some anthologies will actually take their inspiration for the cover from a story in the anthology. And I did not want to do that because I did not want to highlight, one author over the others. I didn't think that would be fair.
Yeah, I agree with that. So Alex, now I think we got connected through Maurice Broaddus.
Yes.
And when he approached you, what was your initial thought? How did that conversation go?
So I was in the middle of school, actually, when I got the message from him. He was just talking to me. He was like, "Hey, I know you're an illustrator. Would you want this job?" And kind of, I was like, "Yeah, let's do it." I'm very treat it like a very professional job. Treat it like, let's get right into it. When I got kind of that message and got in contact with Emily initially, it was really just from the get-go, I was like, I really want to do this. This seems like a really amazing project. Balancing that with classes and towards the end of the school year, it was a little bit of a challenge, but I mean it, all that to say, it was a pretty simple conversation.
Yeah.
But I was very excited to do the project.
Well, I didn't know you were working through school because you turned around things pretty quickly.
I like to think that I like to think that I'm a good illustrator. I like to think that I am better, if not the best, at deadlines. And I can do that better than most, if not all the people that I know. If you give me a project, not only will I get it into you quickly, but it'll be high quality work. I mean, when we first started, you gave me the initial design phase, and I created the original kind of idea for it on the get-go. So when I'm very go type of guy when it comes to getting these things done and doing illustration work.
Now, when you're working with non-artists, sometimes it can be difficult for a non-artist to communicate what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. If for people who might be working with artists in the future, what do you need from them to come up with a concept?
For me, I'm very imaginative. So base level description works really, really well for me. If you contribute a very broad idea of what you want, that works. But if hearing very specific things that you would want within the project gives me a good idea of what I can put into it. I was told at the very beginning, hey, put a dragon in it. And so I put a dragon in it, and those types of specifics, seem simple, but they go such a long way in the actual design and illustration process, which when I wouldn't consider you guys non-creatives. I am also a writer as well. I kind of like meshing both of those things together. But I would say that when it comes to giving an illustrator what you want for a title work or a specific illustration within your work, it works really well to give specifics and give leeway, because if you're hey, I need this super now, people are gonna be whoa, that's not gonna fly. But that's kind of what I got.
And do you often work with references? I mean, I sent you one. Like,
Yeah.
Do you find those helpful, or do you go by your imagination?
I would say with illustrative work, it depends on who you go to. Some people really want that reference. They really want something like that to be like, okay, I have a good idea of what, like, it's not going to hurt if you include that in, like, hey, I really want this for the work. But also if you're too specific, if you send like multiple, being like, these are the type of things that I exactly want, that could hinder the process a little bit, because it's all about finding that, like, creating a relationship with that person that you are like engaging with in like this creative space. So like if you know them well enough and know how they like work and their style, then like maybe if you're like, oh, an image might help this artist. But I am a very imaginative person, so images do help me actually, because I just go all over the place and then I rein it in a little bit right at the end. But yeah, when I got the idea, I really wanted to do a dragon in this, and I really wanted to put some gold in there because I was working on another illustration that had some gold stuff in it, and I was like, I'm gonna sprinkle in little pieces of me in this as well.
That's really cool that you put yourself in it too.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you are part of the anthology. It makes complete sense.
Yeah.
You mentioned hindering when it comes to references, and I thought that's really interesting because I mentioned before, you know, I've done game design and game writing, and I usually give artists a lot of references when it comes to like characters and weapons and things like that. And one time, the artist literally replicated the reference. Like, I mean, like it was. Yeah. Do you find that happen? Like it's
if
too
it's too
obvious?
yes, yeah. If it's too like, it's a interesting process trying to like navigate that, because some people are very on the nose artists, and you can see that through their work. If they're creating illustrations of just fun things that they like on like their Instagram or their website, you're gonna see there are a lot of similarities in the stuff that they do. So like I like comics. If someone draws Wolverine, like beat for beat, that is like photorealism Hugh Jackman, you know, it's gonna be like, you're gonna get that when you submit a photo reference, you know? So like, it's really, depending on what you want, sending the photo reference might be a good idea, it might not be a good idea. You know, but you gotta know your artist. That's the main point. You gotta know your artist, you gotta know who you're working with. Yeah.
How did you feel on the deadlines you got? Was it about the reasonable? Because from a publishing perspective, this was fast. I mean, this is.
I mean, I thought they were too long. I'm gonna be
okay.
very real. I got it done fairly quickly. This was during finals week as well too. I did that while I was doing. But I do work very quickly.
Yeah.
I've kind of developed a fast style that works really well with the stuff that people ask for when I'm doing these types of illustrations. So, I thought honestly the deadlines were like pretty good. Okay. It did not seem short notice or anything like that at all.
We didn't want to rush you, and I'll say this is something that I'm still learning, is that, like you said, if you thought they were too long, we've gotten into situations where we might be publishing something and we need something creative for it, and we don't really need it for like 5 or 6 months. And if you tell the creator, oh, don't worry about it, I don't need it for 5 or 6 months, it might actually feel less important. And then sometimes it doesn't actually get done, or they're going to take the 5 or 6 months and then forget what was going through their head when we were having the conversations about it. So it's kind of a balance from our side of like, it's like, yeah, we don't really need it for this long, but I think we need to set an earlier deadline so we keep it fresh. I'm glad to. I mean, it's neat to hear that, because this is something that I'm learning. We've made mistakes that way.
I will say I'm very like opposed to the natural like status quo there is with certain artists. I do know, I have a lot of friends who work very slow, and that's kind of like they thrive on being very, very thorough in their work, but they also don't do stuff like this, like the things that illustration work or cover work. So I mean, as far as deadlines go, I'm the type of person that's just like, I want to get it done when I get it as soon as possible, so that I just don't got to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
So once I like it, it's really like once I get it done, once it's out of the brain, then I'm like, yeah, okay, we're good. Yeah.
I've got one more question
Yeah.
for you, and then we can open up to some of the questions. When I was looking at when you put together some of the proofs for us to look at, or the layout, and I'm looking at this and I'm going, wow, this isn't one illustration. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 down the rabbit hole illustrations.
Yeah.
Did it feel that way for you when you were putting it together? Because you've got a dragon, but then you have a completely different feel with the knight or the specter, or
yeah. So I am a comic artist at heart. That's kind of what I do a lot of the time. So I immediately, the reason why it feels different is, first of all, if you'll look at the cover, you will notice that there is a very distinct color scheme, which is really, really hard to do in an anthology of horror, sci-fi, and fantasy. Those color schemes do not like in any way kind of go together. So the reason why it feels so different from from kind of like, I treated it like panel to panel, is because I'm using a different background color for each kind of color for each kind of like color block. So I started, when I got this done, I just did like, okay, this is going to be gray, this is going to be like blue. I think this one was initially like a purple or a red, and then just going through and establishing a scenery that goes with that and creating a little world off of that is kind of what I did. It was very like, I started with the dragon because I was like, that's the main guy, and then just kind of worked my way around into like the little spots there at the end. But yeah.
Do you guys have any more questions for each other, for us, for me? I mean, kind of asking it, kind of like this format. Ask each other.
I'm all good here.
All right, Karen had a question.
I'm particularly appreciating the red dragon and like the GenCon mascot,
Yeah.
right? Because as being the largest figure because of what this is. But I also love how you chose to have like the dragon's head leading us into this Fibonacci sequence. So we have this nautiloid discovery of these different worlds. We go sci-fi or from fantasy immediately into sci-fi, but then we're back in fantasy. But this little knight could also read a little Mandalorian-ish,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
right? And then here we're in Dune in the desert, and then we've got Dragon Riders of Pern Fields next. And I enjoy this choice of this nautiloid shape. What led you to that?
The golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, is something that I have been really interested in general. Being a comic artist, I try to find ways to do interesting layouts. And during that time, I was experimenting with using a Fibonacci sequence to establish a kind of layout of characters and like an action sequence. And so after brainstorming and doing some research on previous anthologies, in like the 2011, I looked up previous anthologies that GenCon had done. I established, okay, to make this work, I think I'm going to have to do some aspect of like a golden ratio or something like that, to fit the kind of, when I got what I was told, it was a collage of worlds. I was like, this is going to be a challenge, but I think the golden ratio is the best way to show that.
Yeah.
I had some experience as a house anthologist for a publisher, and a lot of what you talked about is very relevant. I have no experience in actually pitching them to publishers. Do any of you, and could you walk us through that process or offer any advice to anyone who might want to try and sell an anthology to a publisher?
I think that's all you.
No, that's all me. Okay. Yeah, we've done a couple of house anthologies. We've recently had anthologies that we bought. We published an anthology by Bogey Tokach called Rosalind's Siblings. It doesn't quite answer your question because it was an anthology that was already put together, and it's an anthology that celebrates the life of Rosalind Franklin, who was the person who discovered or photographed the DNA double helix, and was a marginalized gender, and it was an anthology on celebrating science and science fiction of marginalized genders. It was being published by a very, very small press in the Franklin family in the UK, and they financially didn't make it, and so Bogey pitched it to us and sold it. But we know Bogey, and when we saw that, it was a real easy sell. I'll just say it was just oh yeah, let's please do it. Selling an anthology is very hard because of the reasons that I said early on. Is anthologies usually don't have a very long shelf life. On the flip side, the and I'm just talking about from a sales perspective. In our experience, anthologies, business-wise, you'll normally see us, and you see this a lot with anthologies, is they'll be kickstarted. And that's a way to get the pre-sales so that you guarantee that you have enough sales to make the anthology, worthwhile, and that you don't lose your shirt on it. If you're going to sell an anthology to a publisher, and this is a real complicated question because sometimes there's an editor will solicit, put the anthology together, have it put in a manuscript form. Here's an anthology. Do you want to buy it? And then you could have the other part where you have an editor pitch the idea of the anthology. Then you do solicitations. There's a question about do the writers get paid by the publisher or do they get paid by the editor? And you can see a whole range of those things. Then there's the case where it could be an in-house anthology, but the publisher solicits the editor and says, we would like you to do an anthology. So unfortunately, I don't have any real good advice on that because that advice is going to be so tailored towards what you're trying to achieve and what you're doing. But I guess if I would say anything is have that concept in mind. Is it a specific themed anthology that could be sold to a specific demographic, like either an event like the GenCon anthology, or is it a specific genre theme that might not be represented well that would be really good to crowdfund and kickstart, or is it more of I'm going to get well-known New York Times best-selling authors, and I'm going to be able to put all of these giant names on the cover, and therefore it will sell because it has these giant names on the cover. That's going to really shape how you go about it. I feel a little embarrassed that I'm like that's a hard question to answer.
More than I had. Thank you.
Okay. Is that?
Yeah, I was just going to. You kind of touched on that. If you already have. There's a difference between having guarantees from big names that they'll work on the projects and actually having their stories in hand.
Absolutely.
Because something might fall through and you may not get that big story. So I was just going to ask, is it better to definitely have those stories in hand? Is it these will go into the anthology?
Yeah, and it's not just you have them fall through, if somebody backs out, you also could have something where you get it and you get the story, and our press has some very strong values that we won't cross lines on, and it might be a big name author, and you might end up with a story that's problematic, and sometimes you can work with them, sometimes you can't. And if you're already promoting this book, so when we kickstart our anthologies, we've already selected the stories in general. It's really scary to take pre-orders on a book that you don't have stories for and you don't know what the finished product's going to look like. And so there's still that big financial risk. We write some of our contracts that has a Kickstarter contingency clause that says, and usually there might be some money up front, but then if the Kickstarter doesn't fund, then everybody goes their own way. And again, it just goes kind of back to the relationship, like, you know, who's the editor, who are the authors, how you feel about them, and also what your goal is with the anthology, and whether, you know, how much risk you're willing to take. But in general, yeah, we like to, you want to have the stories in hand. Yeah. Yes?
I'll contribute to
Yeah.
that if that's all right.
Yeah, please.
Like, we've already spoken about networking and, you know, building your relationships with people in the industry, but you need to know who your audience is. Who is going to buy and enjoy this anthology? Who are they? What do they want to read? And who is writing in those areas so that you can start collecting those things together? And then approaching a publisher, knowing who the publisher is, what they usually publish. That Chris talked about the needs of the press. So when I was creating a story to submit to this with my fingers crossed and my little hopes and dreams, I went to Athos Arts and I read very carefully, you know, what is this press doing? What do they like to publish? What are their beliefs and thoughts and feelings? And I also thought deeply about the audience. It's gonna be my GenCon peeps. I mean, you can see my badge number is 708. My first GenCon was 1996. This is my 26th GenCon. I know my people. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna write something that is for my people and suits the press and the call. But as an anthologist, creating an anthology, you gotta know who your audience is, who the press is that you want to pitch to, and work on those relationships that you have with people in industry so they know they can trust you, that you're gonna get it done. So I've recently proposed an anthology to a press and they've accepted my proposal, but it also has to fit into their publishing schedule. So like I pitched it a year ago and we're still talking, every 6 months we meet and we're like, so now what do you think? And so it's not gonna still be for another year or two before we're even ready to take calls for it. So like, there's a lot of different things. Correct me.
Great answer.
And that trust goes both ways. I mean, the other thing is, not only do you want to like look at what the press is doing and try to make sure that your values align and that you're writing towards that, but also make sure that the press is going to meet their obligations. You see a lot of very well-intentioned, well-meaning small presses are just starting out that have these great ambitions, and they start putting this anthology together, and you know, based on the word count and how much they've offered per word, the budget starts going up, and it could be a real risky project and could fall through. So that trust needs to be earned by the publisher as well, I would say. All right, anything else? All right, well, thank you so much. I just want to say I really enjoyed putting this one together. This is one that I took a lot of personal ownership with, and I feel really great about it. And working with great creatives is just a real joy. I just want to say that.
So yes, absolutely, and it was fantastic working with you. So again, we really want to encourage people to let them know the anthology exists. They can go get it over in the, what are we calling that space?
Coat check.
The coat check room, yeah, by the HQ area. Yeah, we need to come up with a better.
Yeah.
Well, you need to come up with a good title for
Oh,
it.
okay, yeah. And that copy is $20.
This paperback is $25.
Oh, that's $25.
Yeah, this is $25.
The bundle is $20.
Yeah, and a last thing though, is Toiya was very adamant that if we did this project, that this was not a GenCon Writers Symposium anthology that was just done here, sold here, and then it was over. Is that this needed to be a trade publication book. So this book here is a larger trim size, but next month, within a month, there's going to be a trade edition that comes out that will be sold and distributed like normal, and the stories will be eligible for awards, and it's a retail book. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure whether I took down something that you said earlier. You mentioned getting a style guide, and the one that you use. Could you kind of
Yeah,
I wasn't sure I wrote it down properly.
So yeah, there's a couple main style guides in genre fiction. A lot of times they use something called the Chicago Manual of Style, and it goes through everything from proper grammar to, you know, how you do page numbers. Like, you know, should a forward be considered front matter or back matter? What a half title page looks like. You know, whether you should use serif or sans serif fonts. It goes through. I mean, it's like reading the rules of golf book. It's just that it's super detailed on stuff. It's more detailed than that.
My experience when I started writing was that I knew what I wanted to write, but I had no idea what the rules are.
Yeah.
So I'm slowly learning the rules.
And I'll say, I used to give workshops on people that wanted to do self-publish the book, and they wanted to do their own stuff. And the big goal is, how do I make a book look professional and not look amateurish? How does it, you know, so that it can compete with other books? And I said the first thing you do is you open up the Chicago Manual of Style and you turn to page, I think it was 6, and you look at the parts of the book. So you know, hey, I need to have a half title page, and then I need to have a copyright page, and then a full title page. And then if you have more front matter and there's enough of it, then you probably should add a second half title page before you even start page, and that becomes page 1 versus something else. And then, because readers may not know, you know, if something is properly justified or what kerning is or what any, you know, those things are. But they feel, when you pick up a book and you look at it, you know if it feels right or not. And if it just feels off, then it might disrupt your reading experience. So you want to get some very basic things right so that you can be creative with the words.
Yeah, and also I would say that you don't necessarily have to do all that stuff yourself, because it can be very overwhelming, especially when you're starting out. So if you can even afford it, you might find somebody who could do the layout for you, who understands all those, CMOS is the abbreviation for it, who understands all those rules, so you don't have to worry about that.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.